Some months ago, I had the pleasure of talking to Simon Elmer about his experience of fighting back against the lockdown and what it meant to be a public intellectual opposing the state and the state's diktats over the COVID-19 crisis. And we mentioned at that time that Simon had put all these thoughts into a book entitled The Road to Fascism, which I have here. And we said at the time that the book was just out. I hadn't had a chance to read it. So we said we would come back to discuss the book in a bit more detail, which is why we're here today. Simon, welcome back.
Hello, David. Thank you for having me back. Looking forward to talking with you.
Well, it was a good conversation last time. Let's hope I don't let you down. I want to start off. The book's entitled The Road to Fascism, and this obviously has elements of The Road to Serfdom, the famous 1940s book written by Hayek. But you start off, you define fascism, and you quote Robert Paxton as follows. The quote is, "At its fullest development, fascism redrew the frontiers between private and public, sharply diminishing what had once been untouchably private. It changed the practice of citizenship from the enjoyment of constitutional rights and duties to participation in mass ceremonies of affirmation and conformity." This does have enormous echoes of COVID-19 and the state's response to it. Could I ask you to expand a little bit on the parallels you see between fascism as it used to be defined and the nature of the imposition of state diktats that we've just lived through?
Yeah, it's an interesting quote, isn't it? I mean, when I first read it, he goes on to talk about changing the relations between the individual and the collectivity, about the expanding powers of the party and the state, but total control. And also it talks about unleashing aggressive emotions hitherto known in Europe only during war or social revolution. You know, when I read this, I was like, wow, that's a pretty good description of what we've just been going through. When I read it, it was we were still under lockdown at the time. I got the book on the back of reading that quote by Robert Paxton. He's an academic, a US academic. And like most academic books, he wanted to talk about how is this relevant to the kind of the present time. The book was written in 2004, and I think it's in the last chapter. He kind of looks about the return. You know, people are always warning about the return of fascism, and I was very struck that this was a US academic, and all the countries he was looking at, all the instances in which fascism could have potentially have returned, are in things like South American countries. In the kind of places that the US invades or sets up puppet governments and so on. And it didn't seem to occur to him that in fact fascism had returned in his own country, in the United States of America, or that the West in general, under the guiding hand of the US, was returning to the type of authoritarianism, the erasure of independent or individual liberties, of the unleashing of aggressive emotions, which were characteristic of his own definition of fascism. So I think that that attribution of fascism to other countries, other economic systems, struck me from the very beginning. When I wrote this first chapter, The Return of Fascism of my book, the Ukrainian situation was kind of emerging. And again, you know, Ukraine for a long time now, at least until February 2022, was described in the Western press as neo-fascist, or neo-Nazi rather. And then as soon as Russia went into East, the Donbass and so on, suddenly we started calling Putin's government, the Russian Republic, fascist and so on and so forth. So I was very struck that fascism is always used to describe what you're not. And that's the way it's used. I think we talked about this the first time. It's used as an insult particularly by the left, but by liberals, by anarchists, by a huge range of people, to denigrate something as beyond consideration, if you like. And of course, that was a discourse that had been used and continues to be used against us, that anyone who questions the authority of the estate or the unquestionable rightness of this new thing called science with a capital S, this new religion of science, is in some way far right or aligned with fascism. And also, when I first started writing my book and publishing the individual articles on my website, there was a real reaction against the use of the term fascism as well, as if this was something which was a purely historical political formation and was no longer useful as a description of contemporary politics or contemporary geopolitics. So I think the resistance to use fascism to describe the West, and we have to remember, fascism is a European political movement. It was born in Europe. It came out of Europe, and it pretty much conquered Europe for a number of years during the Second World War. And before that, Mussolini set up his government in 1922. So it wasn't in a flash in a pan. It was probably the very first, yes, it was undoubtedly the very first new political movement, and certainly a new form of governance that we've had in a very, very long time in Europe. And I didn't believe that it had gone away. I thought it had come back. I think it had the potential to come back, but it wasn't happening in these other places. It wasn't necessarily or only or exclusively happening in the Ukraine. I think the real threat of fascism isn't sort of men dressed up with Nazi symbols, marching around in the black, giving kind of Hitler signs. I think the real threat of fascism is its return to the political economy of the West. And that's what I see as happening over the last 3 years. And again, when I first started using this term, people were very averse to it. Now, I'm not happy to say, I regret to say, a lot more people have come round to agreeing with me that to describe this new international technocratic form of governance under which we're living, the extraordinary authoritarianism of the state, which it is overseeing, and the extraordinarily rapid transformation of our culture and values of Western democracy, flawed values nevertheless, but in principle, like freedom of speech, like coming to a consensus through debate, like freedom of thought and conscience and so on. The new cultural forms that have emerged to accommodate this new authoritarianism and this rule, this new form of governance by international technocracies, is also, I think, worthy of the description of fascism. So fascism is primarily a political economy, but it can also be used to describe the kinds of ideologies and cultures which have emerged from that.
Like you, I was using the term fascist to describe what we were looking at, and like you, I was getting a certain amount of pushback, and in some of it's perfectly understandable. The obvious upfront nature of the thing that we now call fascism is not the obvious upfront nature of the 1920s, 30s and 40s version. It's not ostensibly military. It's not marching and strutting, and it's not nationalist. Right? It's changed in certain ways, but it remains authoritarian. It remains aggressive. It remains an attack on the individual and a weakening of individual rights as against the right of the state and the greater good. So there are many similarities. I want to pick out a couple of the changes. One is it's not nationalist anymore, it's globalist. And this throws, I think, a lot of people off the hunt when they're looking for fascism. Now, you mentioned this in your book. I'll quote a little bit here. You talk about the rise of global governance. You said over the past 2.5 years, this all but universally embraced common good, the ultimate irreducible, transparent, and utterly illusory referent by which all biosecurity measures have been justified, has been decided not only or even primarily by the elected governments of nation states, but also, and with increasing authority, by the various institutions and organisations of global governance that have been formed by the West, mostly since the Second World War. And then you list them, and it's virtually 2 pages of listing. You start with the Bank of International Settlements, the UN, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, NATO, and on it goes. The 2 pages of international bodies that now form global government in all but name. And we know across a wide range of subject areas, including education and healthcare, that what our individual governments do and argue so passionately for doesn't originate with those governments, doesn't originate with the civil service, doesn't originate in our country at all, but originates in these international global organisations. So there's another aspect I want to get to as well, where contemporary fascism differs from the historical one. But this seems to be one of the absolutely fundamental changes, and not for the better, that fascism has gone global. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, it's. I mean, that is one of the kind of the comebacks that people say that fascism is nationalist, and it's certainly it was nationalist in terms of its kind of cultural ideology around the idea of the Aryan race and so on. But that's very much in Germany. In Italy, it wasn't quite. You didn't have that kind of nationalist sense at all, I think. They were kind of prominent Jewish members of the fascist party in Mussolini's government, and so on and so forth. So I don't think we should reduce that idea of fascism simply to the German model. And as I said, fascism conquered most of Europe for certainly during the entire war period, and was in places like France, for instance, the Vichy government that set up was quite ready to adopt its kind of tenets. And of course, fascisms. It's hard to see them as simply a single government, but it definitely had ideas of conquest. It didn't want to restrain itself. It wasn't interested in fascism in a single country. It had a model of conquest, which it was very successful in perpetuating. But yes, one of the key differences is now, one of the most worrying things about it, in the Second World War, at least, you had some sort of opposition. That's kind of emerging now, I think, with the new agreements between the Russian Republic and China. But yes, in a sense, Europe has got together on the back of the European Union, of course, and all these other international technocracies, which were formulated, as you said, mostly, except for the Bank of International Settlements, after the Second World War, precisely in order to stop individual nations in Europe from falling back, as it were, into fascism. But in fact, a lot of these international technocracies have themselves become unaccountable, unelected, and immensely powerful international technocracies, which are imposing fundamental changes on the democracies that they're meant to defend. I mean, just to pull out a few instances, everyone's wondering at the moment where this idea of 15-minute cities came from, and why it is that local authorities, which we're meant to be voting for today, are suddenly imposing these on their constituents without any kind of democratic process at all. We know, of course, that the 15-minute city has been is a concept dreamed up by the World Economic Forum, which has absolutely no legislative authority over us, no mandate from us at all, and yet somehow our local authorities, councils, and I've worked a lot with councils, and the people that run them are a funny little bunch of people, and somehow they've been told by whom? By their party, by their government, by whom? By their mayor, to implement an idea by the World Economic Forum. I find that extraordinary, and I think we need to investigate why that's happening. Of course, there's even more serious programs being implemented in this country and across the West, like digital ID, like some forms of the World Health Organization have now got this, a form of digital ID, kind of the health pass. We've got things like central bank digital currency, which it seems every country in the world is adopting. I think we've got about 148 at the moment who are looking into it. This is being imposed in this country by the Bank of England. Again, this is not a government body. This is a private company. What else have we got? We've got the tenets of environmental fundamentalism coming out of Agenda 2030. That's at least something that our government did sign up to, although I don't remember them asking us whether we voted for it at all. So one of the ways to define fascism, the political economy of fascism, historically, is that it comes out of failed democracies. And in the West, democracy has failed, absolutely undoubtedly, I think. The farce that we're going through of electing for this is literally that. It's a farce, because it's quite clear if you listen to Rishi Sunak, our unelected Prime Minister, who is when he was chancellor, he was the first person to start pushing central bank digital currency. Or if you listen to Keir Starmer, who recently was asked, "What's your choice between Westminster and the World Economic Forum?" And he said without a blink of an eye, "Oh, the World Economic Forum." And I thought that was grounds for him resigning his post immediately, because he was elected, I don't know what constituency he is, but he was elected by his constituents to represent them. And he was represented by the members of his party, the Labour Party, to represent the people of Britain sufficiently to form a government. God forbid it. He certainly wasn't elected to implement the dreamed up, frankly, totalitarian programs and technologies of the World Economic Forum. And yet he had no hesitation in saying, "Oh no, I'm definitely on the side of the Economic Forum." And it seems somehow that, well, not somehow, I think it's been 40, 50 years of neoliberalism, that all our democratic institutions, our political parties, our civil society, our unions, all the institutions that constitute civil society, everything that could have, and was meant to provide a barrier, a check, a forum for debate and questioning to this vast takeover that we've seen over the last few years, have been co-opted by these international technocracies. I don't think it's any more, well, actually it is. It's more complex, but it's partly because of money. It's the fact that people like Bill Gates have simply bought up, it seems, every medical institution in the globe. But it's more than that, I think. They've also been co-opted ideologically as well. The kind of meetings I have with people, someone got up the other day, an architect, and he said he went to a con, all they talked about was having to combat and crisis, global warming, and the surety that we had to do our bit to stop it. And there was absolutely no questioning at all by anyone about whether there was any truth in this, or what these tenets were serving, what it means to net zero, what are 15-minute cities actually benefiting, who are they, and all this sort of stuff. So there's been a financial takeover of these institutions, of our democracy, but there's also been an ideological one as well, and it's come very, very quickly. Not only environmental fundamentalism, but kind of transhumanism, most horrendously represented by kind of so-called trans rights, the ideology of woke. These are all very recent things, I think, and yet they seem to have been adopted without question by not only our governments, our political parties, our unions, but also by our education institutions, by our cultural institutions as well. Now, I don't think there's been any ideological movement which has achieved that rapidity and completeness of colonization of education, institution, and parliament, as woke has done, if we want to call this for a kind of an umbrella thing, since fascism. And I think there's parallels between that. I never voted for the principles of woke to be things that I have to sign up to in order to get a job. I don't want my children going to school and being taught the principles of trans rights. I don't want to go into education or cultural institutions and be bombarded by the propaganda of things I don't agree with. These are things that very recently, a few years ago, we would have said, oh, hold on, we don't have official ideologies in a democracy, but you do when you're living in a fascist state. And I think that's what we are in now.
That's an excellent analysis of what we're facing. We talked about the globalist aspect of this, and you raised the very good question, and a question that we've often had to face and not necessarily found easy answers to, which is, why do all the councillors, all the organisations, all the various institutions which have surrendered to this ideology, why do they do it? Who tells them what to do? Who says, right, this week, lads, it's 15-minute cities? Right? Who actually issues the instruction? And why do they just meekly comply? It's the meek compliance that's very puzzling. Now, so I'm going to suggest to you that there's the global aspect of this, which is very much top-down. What makes it particularly dangerous and particularly successful is that simultaneously there's been another assault on our liberties, which is bottom-up, and it's one of this ideological capture of the West and the ideological surrender of our people to the ideas which you've summarised as woke. I'll give you an example of how this plays out. There's a left-wing SNP socialist feminist lesbian called Joanna Cherry. And she's not awfully happy with certain aspects of the woke agenda, namely the trans agenda and the fact that biological males have been admitted into women-only spaces, such as toilets and changing rooms. And I absolutely agree with her position on this. So she was booked to have a conversation, a public conversation in Edinburgh, city of the Enlightenment, Edinburgh, in a comedy club, would you believe? A comedy club where the idea is people are meant to be saying quite outrageous things and challenging the norm because in there lies comedy. So she's been cancelled from this. She's been no platformed. But the comedy club is saying, well, it would have been entirely wrong for us to no platform Joanna Cherry because we don't agree with the political views. That would have been wrong. No, the reason she can't appear in our club is our staff have such violent objection to her anti-trans hate speech that they are refusing to turn up to work on that night. We cannot therefore staff the premises. We cannot therefore provide basic levels of safety and security, and therefore we're very sorry, but we've no option other than to cancel the event. So the cancellation was from the bottom up. It was the staff who cancelled Joanna Cherry. And I've seen this operate in other places at other times. Very nearly, I saw the beautiful saxophonist Gillard Atzman. He was very nearly cancelled from a jazz concert recital in Glasgow because the staff in the venue had been told so many things about his political views, things that actually were not true. They hadn't read any of his political views, but they had been told lots of scary things about his political views, and they were threatening to walk out. And it was only saved by Gillard himself going to the staff, say, I'm here, if you've any questions about anything that I've written or said, ask me now, I'll answer any questions. And with that, the opposition kind of ebbed away. But if he hadn't confronted it in that open manner, that concert might have been cancelled. Joanna's been cancelled. And it's coming from the bottom up. So it's coming from the people being convinced, or I think not so much convinced, more intimidated and overwhelmed by the ideology and not finding the ability to resist. How does one resist this creeping fascism? Because it presents itself as intrinsically good and intrinsically scientific and intrinsically right, even though it's intrinsically irrational. It's a strange conflict. Do you see this bottom-up mechanism in operation? And if you do, how would you suggest people learn to resist?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the second one. I definitely agree that this is a bottom-up thing. In the second part of my book, not all fascisms are totalitarian, and not all totalitarianisms are fascism. But fascism, which is successful, if you like, kind of inevitably moves towards a kind of a totalitarian system of domination. And in the latter part of my book, I think the last two chapters, I look at one of the best writers about totalitarianism, which is Hannah Arendt, the German political theorist, who was herself an escapee from the Third Reich. She got out, fortunately, just before, she managed to escape. And she wrote her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And in it, she's very eager to differentiate totalitarianism, the uniqueness of it, this novel form of governance, as she calls it, from other forms of tyranny or dictatorship or so on and so forth, which of course have been around for thousands of years. And one of the things we can talk about them in detail later, but one of the things she particularly focuses on is exactly what you said. Tyranny and dictatorship come from top down. And there's only a certain degree of success, I think, that you can have in a system of oppression of control, of domination, which only comes from the top. If you want a successful society, if you want a productive society, you can, of course, oppress people till they become basically a prison state. But it's not going to be very productive. It's not going to be successful. It's kind of got a time limit on it. But you can have a very successful, productive society if that oppression, if it's not really the right word, but that form of control is not something which comes from above, but which comes from the bottom up. And that's when the role of ideology becomes absolutely crucial to the success of that, the functioning of the state. There's a move beyond that, I think, as well, which is about transhumanism. Hannah Arendt also says that the ultimate goal of a totalitarian society is to render human beings redundant to its functioning. Human beings, even if, why go about ideologically indoctrinating human beings when you can take any instances of choice to their hands? So something like central bank digital currency, digital ID, 15-minute cities, these are going to be imposed by automatic systems in which you don't need someone, you don't need a guard there. You don't need someone to say, well, you can spend your money on this, you can't spend your money on that. The central bank digital currency will do it otherwise. But to go back to your point, I think, another of the primary evidence, if you like, one of the key evidences that we are living or moving into a totalitarian system is because it does seem that this control of thought, this no playing, this the overseeing of speech, thought, expression, art, culture, anything at all, is not being done by the police. It's not being done by the government. It's not being done by the councils, although they're all contributing to it. It's being done by the people themselves. I think the COVID moment, we talked about that last time, that 2 years where we descended into something like a Stasi state where everyone was watching everyone else. The police came out with extraordinary figures on how many people were ringing them up and saying, I think my next door neighbor might be breaking lockdown rules. So that encouraged a sort of, it kind of authorized that sort of behavior, that by reporting someone who was not towing the line, that phrase that they use, not doing your bit, that became seen not as something which is, you should be guilty about, but as the highest form of civic virtue, which is to not only be obedient to the government, but to do the duty, if you like, of the secret police. I think COVID was that moment, but I think also it's in our technologies as well. Every time you order a hamburger in McDonald's, if you order it on your iPhone, afterwards it will send you something saying, how do you think you did with it, how we did with this? If I order a book from Amazon, afterwards it will say, how was that experience for you? If I book a hotel, afterwards they'll write to me and say, could you give us some feedback on it? So we're in a kind of culture, I think. We're in kind of a technology. Technology has created a culture in which we're constantly being asked to pass judgment on people. Of course, social media is the kind of the exemplar of that. So I think this generation of young people who have been brought up and very rapidly indoctrinated into the principles of woke. Woke is a fascist ideology. It makes no platforming and censorship a default option. And it doesn't engage in debate because, as you said, it sees its principles, whether that's that men or women can change sex, or we can go into them later maybe, that these are unquestionable truths, that man-made, that environment, the globe is warming because of man-made carbon emissions. These are things which are unquestionable. They are religious tenets. And when you've got that combination of young people who are absolutely sure they are right, which of course that's what young people do. I can still remember when I was young and I thought I was absolutely right as well. What's changed now is that assurity, that absolute certainty of being correct, and the anger of this world that as they grow up, they're beginning to realize what a state this world is and what they've been given as their inheritance. That anger with the assurity of being right has been turned by very clever people into a way to control all of us by taking the frankly infantile beliefs of a very small part of the population. They have managed to use that to control the rest of us who don't agree with them. I think that's the big difference now, and that's what fascism did as well. It placed the authority and the power and the wealth of the state in the service of what was originally a kind of a marginal political and ideological movement. As you said, Mussolini began as some form of socialist, but he very quickly became a fascist. Fascism is very good at using the power of the state to take extremist positions and make them a mainstream ideology for controlling the whole of the population as well. I live in London, I live in central London, and, when I go to galleries now, if I go to a museum, if I go to a show, I'm always worried that I'm going to have to face this kind of woke ideology, and I'm very careful about not going there. But, I talk to people in pubs and stuff, and I actually think the real population that believes, the real believers, the COVID faithful, the environmental fundamentalists, the woke compliant, these are actually quite a small group of people. I think they're young, they're university educated, if you can call it education, and they mostly live in North London. But they have got the power of the state behind them. This sort of image that we're inundated with daily of a handful of people walking along a street with some banners saying, "Just stop oil." The reason that they're allowed to do that is because they're protected by the police. And I think that's a kind of a model of how the state that we live in now, this kind of totalitarian, this beginning to be totalitarian state, by attributing consensus to something which doesn't have a consensus amongst the people, amongst the actual population, by protecting these marginal views and elevating them to orthodoxies, they're able to take very, very extremist and unquestioned ideas like environmental fundamentalism, like trans rights, like the COVID, the Church of COVID, and they make them mainstream. They make them the norm, and they pretend that it's actually got a consensus, and that's a very dangerous thing.
One of the aspects of this that propels it forward is the degree to which the faithful to the woke ideology perceive huge risk. The rationale behind the extreme positions they take is that the threat is extreme. So we don't have the flu. We've got a global pandemic that will wipe us out. We don't have pollution. We've got runaway tipping point global warming, which will wipe us out. We don't have people who are confused about sexuality. We have transgender people who are a unique people unto themselves and who are being literally murdered and exterminated. It's only if you believe the hype, the woke believe the hype, that they can justify, with some degree of internal rationality, even though the overall position's irrational, that they can justify the lockdown, they can justify the abuse, they can justify the disruption, the throwing beans at great works of art, and other nonsense like this. It doesn't make any sense on the surface, but when you take into account the great evil, capitalized, I would suggest, that they seek to save us from, it all becomes justified in hindsight. You mentioned also the issue of religion, and it's very much a religion. I would agree with that. In your book, you quote Milan Kundera as follows: Totalitarianism is not only hell, but is also the dream of paradise, the age-old dream of a world where everybody would live in harmony, united by a common will and faith, without secrets from one another. If totalitarianism did not exploit these archetypes, which are deep inside of us and rooted deep in all religions, it would never attract so many people, especially during the early phase of its existence. Once the dream of paradise starts to turn into reality, however, here and there, people begin to crop up who stand in its way. And so the rulers of paradise must build a little gulag on the side of Eden. In the course of time, the gulag grows bigger and more perfect, while the adjoining paradise gets smaller and poorer. I thought that was a very good quote, but the key issue of the religious aspect of this and the selling of paradise, utopia is just around the corner. If only we could destroy the insert buzzword, patriarchy, oil industry, we could achieve net zero. Whatever the thing that needs destroyed happens to be, it's standing in the way of utopia, of paradise, of a secular version of the kingdom of God on earth, of the perfection that mankind really is, they believe. If only we could eliminate these old-fashioned ideas. And so we end up with a religion, we end up with a desire for utopia that energizes the thing, but it's based on very fundamental and irrational beliefs, and it fails to have an understanding of, for example, what human beings are. And this disconnect from reality, coupled with the desire for utopia and the belief that if they can just crush the opposition, utopia will emerge, makes it all the more dangerous. So you then go on to explore the role of human rights and the rights agenda and the selling of fascism by selling the utopia it's meant to achieve. Could you expand a little bit on this particular line? In what ways are the rights agenda and the desire for the end of all suffering being exploited to actually increase the amount of oppression that our societies are imposing on all of us?
Yeah, it's a very complex one, isn't it? I mean, first of all, from the beginning, I've written about, I call them the COVID faithful. I thought it was the founding of a new church. Our own Archbishop of Canterbury, basically laid down the tenets of his own church and became a kind of a spokesman for the COVID church. I think religions always rise when the complexity of the world becomes too much to understand. Utopias are about, as you said, reducing things to single ideas, usually violent ones, which gives us entrance into the kingdom of heaven. You either have to give things up or you have to get rid of something or whatever. I think the world is now so complex, and not only that, but through our technology, we are exposed to the complexity of the world all the time. Most of us get up and we'll turn on some social media and we'll see a whole range of things, something about the coronation, something about Just Stop Oil, something about an environmental disaster, something about a war going on in the country that a few months ago we didn't know about. And something about something's going on in Sudan and that complexity becomes very threatening to us because we're constantly told by the media that we need to understand this, we need to have a position on it, we need to say something about it, and that's fairly new, I think, in how we understand ourselves in the world. And I think religion fills in that space when it comes in. By religion, I mean kind of ideologies which are fundamentalist ideologies. And they come in and they say, it's okay, we're going to explain this. We're going to find out what the essence of the problem is. and we're going to tell you how to overcome this. And the environmental, fundamentalism is a kind of a religion, which reduces the extraordinary complexities of what we're facing in capitalism, in the nature of capitalism having to expand, about the diminishment in natural resources, about the difficulties of pollution, in how we feed, house, and give energy to a growing population. In other words, the future of the world. This is an extraordinary complex series of situations, factors. But they don't present this kind of immediate and present danger, which is the apocalypse, the end of the world. The amount of times people put up these kind of timelines that were given by the environmental fundamentalists, which started about 40 years ago when they said, we were having, ice caps, and then it was global warming, and the world was going to be over in 10 years, and then 20 years, and then 30 years, and so on and so forth. But of course, if you've got a terrified population, and you say to them, I'm going to scare the hell out of you, but I'm going to offer you a chance of salvation, you've got a population which is very controlled. I lived in America for a few years, sort of a decade or so ago. And I saw that this population, every time you turned on the TV, it was wall-to-wall news about shootings and killings and drugs and breakdown of society and stuff. And I said to one of my students there, I said, well, what's all this about? And she said, they were scared. They were scared all the time. And I've watched with horror how the UK, which has been kind of merging into the, whatever it is, 52nd state of the US for some time now, has produced a population which is always scared, which is always being terrorized. And then we're becoming a more religious population, I think. We used to sort of look down our noses a little bit at the US citizens as being, very, very fundamentalist and very religious. We've become religious in a different way now. We found our different religions. We found the religions of woke, of environmental fundamentalism, of COVID, and so on. And it offers to people who are confused and threatened by the complexity of the world, and who have been deliberately terrorized by the state, their governments, and the media, into saying, okay, I'm going to find a way out. When you talk to these people like Just Stop Oil, when they get up and they make their statements, as you said, they say, I know we're being extreme, but the alternative is the end of the world. So that is a primary tenet of fascism, that the end justifies the means. And any government that says, okay, we're going to take away all your wealth, we're going to take away your money, we're going to take away your housing, we're going to reduce your energy consumption, but we're doing it because we're going to save the planet. Saving the planet is kind of the ultimate, end game, isn't it? I think it's also, this isn't only about making a compliant and complacent population. It's also, with that, what they do with it. And I think one of the ways to understand this is that now every crisis is turned into a health crisis. Everything's turned into a threat to your health. If you get someone up saying, a woman sort of saying, I think it's very important that we have women-only spaces, and actually I don't want grown men walking into my daughter's changing room and getting his penis out. It's things we would think as fairly rational and also moral kind of stances. And someone will turn around and say, who is pro-trans rights, will say, in doing so, you're denying the very existence of trans people. That's a characteristic of ideological thinking, as described by Hannah Arendt, where you go from a first premise, which then justifies completely ludicrous and irrational conclusions which are made from that. A mother wanting her daughter to be able to change at school or in the local baths and not be confronted by a male man is not denying the existence of people who identify as transsexual. And yet these are the arguments that are given to us. If the consequences of any form of disagreement, if I go, well, do you think we should really be implementing the political and technological changes required by Agenda 2030 and its commitment to having net zero emissions by 2050? Should we think about that, what implications that's going to have on the populations of the world, not just in Europe and the West, but in the global South? And who do you think is going to be benefiting by this? Even asking those questions, now I am causing the death of the planet. If I have any kind of questions about woke or trans rights, I'm denying the existence of people. So when you make questioning itself every crisis becomes a health crisis, you take into possession the population itself. The population has to be protected from ideas which are not merely unorthodox, but which are a threat to our existence. If I question the ULEZ scheme being imposed on London by Sadiq Khan, which is going to impoverish huge numbers of people who actually have to move around the city, make it almost impossible for them to work, as far as I can make out, we are endangering the planet. So everything is rushed up immediately to the most extreme. One of the things I don't write about in my book, because it hadn't come out yet, but which I've been writing about more recently, is the World Health Organization's Pandemic Treaty. It's got a long title, Pandemic Prevention Preparedness Response Treaty. And it's a kind of an extraordinary document which the UK has been one of the primary signatories to, and one of the states which is trying to make it legally binding to all its signatories. And I think there's something like 190, pretty much the whole world is going to sign up to it. And one of the things it says is that health, it defines health as a state of complete well-being. And it now says, under the terms of the treaty, health as so defined, I mean, that's a completely utopian idea itself, isn't it? It's a completely meaningless definition of something which an organization concerned with protecting the health of the population. It's a completely meaningless definition of a working definition, if you like. But it says that definition of health is now a fundamental right. That is, it's not one of those conditional rights which we found out under lockdown meant almost nothing. Rights of freedom of expression, rights of freedom of thought, rights of freedom of movement, rights of freedom of association. Under the European Convention on Human Rights, which we're about to leave in this country, those are defined as conditional rights, and they're conditional upon what the state, that is the government, decides is the common good, the ultimate good. But under the WHO Treaty, health is going to be a fundamental right. It's not subject. And it even says that the right to health is irrespective, or regardless, I think is the term they use, of our age, our race, our religion, and also our political beliefs or our economic and social circumstances. What this suggests to me is even if they reduce us to poverty under lockdown, even if they take away our belief that actually a mask made from an old T-shirt is not going to stop a microbe 1/10,000th of an inch wide, no matter what I have my political beliefs or even religious beliefs of people who don't believe in being injected, for instance, with experimental gene therapies, which strikes me as a very scientific belief, not a religious one. All of this, under the terms of the treaty, is going to be irrespective. It's going to be regardless. It's not justification for saying, actually, I disagree with this international technocracy. So when every crisis is made a health crisis, and not addressing that crisis is actually threatening the lives of the people under consideration, or even their health, and expanding out to the health of the planet, saving the planet, you've created a form of governance which is not only non-democratic, it's actually anti-democratic. And once that ideology has spread through society, as it has in our parliament, our education system, and our media, and our cultural industry, the very terms for debate, and also our civic society, the terms for contesting this have been removed. And that, I would say, that's what a totalitarian system is.
You come across a very interesting word there, well-being. Well-being is a word that we've been talking about a lot. I used to think it went back to the name person fight, where the Scottish government were pushing for a Creepy Orwellian child watching scheme, where every child in the country had a state-appointed overseer. And this was all being based on well-being. Well-being was everything. We must intervene in a child's life if there is a potential future threat to well-being. Okay. Many questions arose. How do you know about future threat? And of course, what do you mean by well-being? And they couldn't define it. So because they couldn't define it, they split it into, I think it was 8, with the acronym SHANARI. And each of these 8 things well, many of them were themselves notably vague, as was noted by the United Kingdom Supreme Court as they threw out the legislation. And some of the advocates of well-being, the leaders, the contemporary leaders in the idea of well-being, when they're asked to define it, one of them was on Radio 4, the description was, well, well-being's not a beach you can lie on. It's a dance. Right? What does any of this actually mean? In terms of public policy, what does it mean? It means anything you want, of course. But we're now seeing if well-being, if health is an absolute right, which the state can then essentially enforce and control people to make sure this absolute right is achieved, and presumably use violence if it's obstructed, because it's the same as thou shalt not kill, right? We could use violence to stop people killing one another. Therefore, if this is of the same standard, presumably we can use violence as a state to ensure the health outcomes. And if health is now defined as well-being, well, so is the economy. Right? The Scottish government is always talking about how we must change the economy from something based on economics, we don't want to talk about that, to something based on well-being. It's going to be a well-being economy. Now, again, nobody can define what this is. What's the difference between a well-being economy and an economy? Right? And there's no precision. There's simply a vague emotional call to, well, everyone will be happy in the new utopia. And if you're in the way of this, you're on the wrong side of history, you need to get out of the way, you're literally killing people. And it is very much presented in there. So we're seeing not only everything becoming a health problem, that everything includes the economy. So what used to be the defining battleground of political ideas through the 70s and 80s, in my lifetime, for sure, what used to be the area where an American politician famously said, it's the economy, stupid, right? What actually matters? We're now seeing that's becoming subsumed under the term well-being, and that's subsumed under the term health. And I don't think you're exaggerating when you're saying everything becomes a health problem. Because obviously, if the economy goes down, then people will become sicker because they'll be unhappy and they'll be on the dole. And, well, this is a health issue, and if we accept the state has the right to act in a totalitarian way over health, then ultimately it can act in a totalitarian way over everything, because everything, including what you think, will affect your health. Because if you have unhealthy thoughts, well, this is going to have a bad health outcome. It's surely reasonable for the government to act and change your thoughts. And this takes us into the gulags. This takes us into the sort of thought modification that Maoism was associated very strongly with. This takes us into totalitarianism in the most extreme form, because your thoughts, your beliefs become fair play for a well-being dedicated government to go and correct, because you're suboptimal. Just before we go into another quote from your book, am I overstating that, or do you see this? Do you see these?
No, I agree.
Emerging?
This term well-being has been it's been coming in everywhere, hasn't it? It's after lockdown, after people have been locked down for 2 years, and the economic devastation that wreaked on people's lives, and the kind of the psychological effect of it as well, of having kids being masked and not going to school, and people having to the entire devastation wreaked by lockdown. This is even before we get onto the gene therapies and stuff. All these adverts started coming up, sort of saying, are you suffering? How do we address this through your well-being? Being being impoverished by the government is now not an economic issue. It's about how do you adjust to your new impoverishment. If you don't agree with what the government is saying, it's like, how can we bring you around to agreeing with us? It pathologizes dissent. If I disagree with environmental fundamentalism, as I do, and I've written about, it's because I am mentally unbalanced. That's effectively what it's saying. In my new books that are coming out, maybe it's just later, one of the articles was about this appalling document that was produced by some Oxford academics who were in the field of psychology and also gene therapy, effectively. And the government put out a kind of a call for how we can get around the human rights barriers to enforced vaccination, enforced injection, enforced gene therapies. And this bunch of Oxford professors got together and they went through and they wrote this article, which I kind of pull apart. And they said that basically what we can do is we can, under the Mental Health Act, I think it's 1983 or 1986, we can section members of the public who don't agree with being injected with gene therapies. I've read a lot of terrifying stuff over the last 3 years, but that document is definitely up there, probably with the pandemic treaty. I think those two are the two most terrifying documents I've read. And they're both around this similar idea that if you disagree with this manufactured consensus, whether that's manufactured through the government or the media or so on, you don't have a difference of opinion. You are mentally ill. And therefore, we have to correct you whether you like it or not. You know, recently we had Tony Blair at the last few months ago, wasn't it? The last annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, talking about imposing digital ID on the whole world. And it was quite clear that he wasn't asking countries, including our own country, whether we wanted to have a digital ID imposed on us. And he said quite openly, this is going to have applications beyond health. Health, well-being, it's about biopolitics. Biopolitics is where you take possession of the body of the population, regardless of their brain, what they want, what their opinions are, or mostly important of all, what their rights are as a citizen under a democratic state. Their rights to disagree with you, their rights to speak their disagreement, their rights to go and meet other people. All these are erased when under something like the Pandemic Treaty, the World Health Organization, and the individual states, the member states who will impose their decision, says, we are doing this for your own good. We are going to enforce you. We're going to force you to have an injection. We're going to make it a requirement to wear a mask. We're going to lock down and destroy your economy. We're going to impose digital ID. We're going to impose central bank digital currency, if you like. All these things can be imposed because it's for your well-being. So I think I think that term, it is absolutely everywhere at the moment. And it renders the old politics of left and right, which doesn't exist anymore, completely redundant. Perhaps one of the most scary developments of that is what's happened. I think it's just about happened, hasn't it? Has it been passed in Ireland? They've got this hate speech bill where if you even possess on your computer, presumably a book, they're talking about the books on my shelf, that if this is considered hate speech, which is again another undefined, all-encompassing term like well-being, that you can be arrested and that information can be taken away from you. When I use terms like totalitarian, you do as well, I'm not joking. These are totalitarian measures. The difference with historical totalitarianism is it's going to be done by a matrix of technology and programs, which we've never seen before. We don't have to have, the Gestapo coming around and knocking our door in the night. They will simply inform me that because of something I've written or something I've read or something I've taught or something my child has told someone that I said at school or anything like that, or something I have a chat online, or God knows, maybe I'm heard in a pub, that suddenly my bank account has been suspended. These are realities which are upon us. And I think we have to face up to them.
Yes, in Scotland there's a hate crime bill that is so grievous that it's not actually yet been put into practice. It's been passed by the Parliament, but it's not actually put into practice. And it includes what you say around your own dinner table, if that's reported to authorities, and it's it's determined to be hateful or likely to promote hate, and of course none of these things are defined, then the state can act upon you to save presumably the rest of your family from your appalling opinions. That is about as totalitarian as things get, and that's still on the statute book, albeit not in practice in Scotland. Scotland and Ireland are quite similar in many regards, with the willingness that with which they are surrendering to the woke ideology, whether it's because they are formerly religious countries who have lost their faith and are looking for another one, whether it's part of small country syndrome where they're looking to have a presence on the international stage by being superior, by being more obedient, by being more righteous as the woke ideology defines righteousness, and therefore earning for themselves some form of respect that they perhaps don't feel they're earning in other ways. I'm not quite sure what's driving it. Scotland's always been an early adopter of ideas. This can be both good and bad. Whether it's the Reformation or the Enlightenment or the woke ideology, we seem to be at the forefront of accepting this. And of course, with the woke ideology, this is, I would argue, very bad. Just before we leave the issue of the well-being economy and the changes we're seeing to matters economic, you cover this also in your book. You quote here, Fabio Vichy talking about historical fascism, and he writes, a cornerstone of historical fascism was industry controlled by government whilst remaining privately owned. It is quite astonishing that despite the overwhelming evidence of systemic revolving doors between public and private sector, most public intellectuals have not yet realised that this is where we are heading, right? And this is one of the things that makes fascism quite difficult to pin down, because the right is reassured by the fact to say, look, we've still got private property, right? It's not communism, and the left is reassured by, look, it's state control. We're not letting the nasty capitalists do what they want. They're completely controlled by legislative, administrative, and bureaucratic means. We're the boss. They're not the boss. And it rather turns off the areas where opposition should come from, where people actually believe in something and saying, well, actually, hang on, I've got a problem with that. Because it's this all things to all people, malleable ideology. It's not really one thing or the other. And looking at, for example, Hitlerian Germany, the degree to which the state dictated everything that happened in the factories was astonishing. And if the nominal owner objected, he would find himself the ex-nominal owner. As I think Mr. Junkers, who made aeroplanes, he was one of the first factory owners to lose his factories because he didn't go along with what the party was instructing. But you also quote the awful Israeli academic Yuval Noah Harari in this book, commenting some sort of latter-day Joseph Goebbels, which I thought was quite appropriate. And the quote is, in the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, what humanity learned to produce was stuff like textiles and shoes and weapons and vehicles. And this was enough for the very few countries that underwent this revolution, fast enough to subjugate everybody else. What we are talking about now is like a second industrial revolution, but the product this time will not be textiles and machines or vehicles or even weapons. The product will be humans themselves. We are basically learning to produce bodies and minds. Bodies and minds are going to be basically the two main products of the next wave. If there's a gap between those that know how to produce bodies and minds and those who do not, then this gap will be far greater than anything which we've been seen before in history. So he's talking about, now, I think he's actually well off beam. I mean, he's a public intellectual, but I think he talks more rubbish than any other public intellectual currently on the scene. But he's talking about changes to society coming around from technological change. And this technological change, as we've seen from historical fascism, is going to be state-directed, state-controlled, but in nominal private hands, with vast amounts of private wealth to be earned by the ideologically compliant. So this couples personal greed and quite a lot of nasty human traits with the objectives of the state. This is the genius of fascism. It takes the worst of humanity and couples it to the objectives of totalitarianism. And it makes it more threatening than perhaps communism, which tends to collapse more rapidly and generate more obvious signs of distress and decay, perhaps at an earlier stage, and as a result can be maybe resisted more effectively. Communism also had a specific ideology that rather spelled out how they wanted to go about things, and that didn't work, and that's something you can argue against. Whereas the woke ideology, there is no agenda that's actually spelt out. It's all movement. We're going to go towards the utopia. Don't ask too many questions about the details. You just got to believe. So we're seeing an increasing fascist takeover of what has historically been a free market, privately owned capitalist system in the West. And we're seeing it being directed towards ideological aims which are presented as being driven by technology, but are not being driven by technology, are being driven by decisions made in the global organizations, the tax-exempt foundations, and organizations such as the World Economic Forum and the UN. Is that a reasonable summary of the economic direction of travel?
Yeah, I think so. I think I generally agree with you. I mean, what's his name? Harari is a strange, repulsive little man. He is exactly what Goebbels. But I think, like a lot of intellectuals, he places too much emphasis on technology. And when he talks about producing bodies and minds, which reminds me of Tony Blair talking about winning hearts and minds, it's the similar sort of idea. I think he's talking a bit like Aldous Huxley. He saw the sort of the future revolution coming through a kind of a transformation of the biological, what we are as human beings. And there's definitely an aspect of that in terms of this technology becoming part of us now. But my own view is that the real change, the production of bodies and minds, is not going to come technologically so much. It's going to become through ideological changing, and also through mechanisms of compliance, which have a technological basis, like central bank digital currency. That is a system of total control over people, and it really doesn't matter what you think. We don't have to invade bodies when your money is, completely in control of central banks, or digital ID and things like that. So I think in that respect, the new technologies are producing not new bodies and minds, but new mechanisms of compliance. But to go back to what you were saying about the economy, there's a great quote from an art historian actually called T.J. Clark, and he published a book in 1999 called Farewell to an Idea, and it was about the history of modernism. And he ended it close towards the end. He says, "Whether or not the age of revolutions is over, the age of state formation has just begun." I think, we've been told by neoliberalism, one of the tenets of our neoliberalism is the dismantling of the state, that we'd have sort of a big society, the kind of the David Cameron sort of thing. I don't think that's at all. I think what we're seeing over the last 3 years, very, very rapidly, is this transformation and this enormous expansion of the power of the state. And it's done that through its merger with corporations, which, as you say, is one of the definitions of fascism. Mussolini's famous quote, which may be apocryphal, that fascism is when you can't pass a cigarette paper between the interests of corporations and the interests of the government. And that's definitely what we've got now. The state has been for a long time, but its authoritarianism is allowing it to is allowing the corporations which are driving it to turn their decisions into laws, which is where this great authoritarianism has come from. But I think at the same time, while we have this vast increase in laws under which we're being forced to live, and also the nature of the laws, like hate laws, which are penetrating right into, as you said, the example of the kitchen table, what you're sitting around talking to your parents. We've got that, but on the other hand, at the other end of the scale, the corporations themselves are operating within a kind of an anarchist space. The state is more and more authoritarianism. The society is more and more totalitarianism. But the corporations now are absolutely out of control. They don't seem to have any kind of limits to what they can do. The behavior of these corporations like Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, JP Morgan and so on in the Ukraine, who are basically going in there and taking over the economy and buying up the assets and so on. The oil companies are going in and stuff like now. And then, all these enormous amount of, so-called aid and guns and armaments that we're sending Ukraine because we're so generous and we're to defeat the Russians are now being kind of sold on by shell companies set up by Ukrainian ministers, and they're selling on to arm dealers around the world. This is absolute anarchy. It's a kind of it's the anarchy of corporate anarchy or corporate capitalism at work. So I'm always struck where that we're being constantly told by the government that we need law and order. We are the party of law and order. I think that's come back for Labour now, isn't it? We're going to cut. At the moment we got Rishi Sunak saying we're going to cut down on corruption, which is a good one. And yet at the same time, these because these governments are now merely the administrative bodies of international technocracies who are operating under this new paradigm, new political economy, which is called stakeholder capitalism. The role and function of our elected governments and the state apparatus is to keep us under greater and greater control. But in doing so, they have completely yielded whatever control they ever once had over the global corporations who make up this stakeholder capitalism. The model of stakeholder capitalism is that set up in March 2020 when the lockdown was imposed and the World Health Organization declared this pandemic when there was something like 17 people whose deaths had been attributed to it in the world. And at the same time, the World Health Organization merged with the WEF. And the WEF announced the COVID Action Platform Group, which was at the time 1,100. Now it's up to about 1,200 of the most powerful companies in the world from both the West and the East. It's got not as many, but it's got all the big Chinese corporations in there, state corporations, as it does Western banks. And it's primarily made up of not of industrial manufacturers, as you might suspect, but of banks, of asset managers, of information technology companies, of the most powerful corporations in the world. And they are the ones running the world. They are the ones who create, who compose. They are the stakeholders in stakeholder capitalism. And it's they who make up the international technocracies, who issue these orders, who come up with these ideas like 15-minute cities, which the state then is merely imposing upon us. So on the one hand, we're living under more and more draconian laws and restrictions, not just merely on our movements and our actions, but on our very thoughts. At the same time, the people who are ultimately deciding these, making these decisions, the corporations themselves, are living in a kind of an anarchist paradigm. It's not an anarchist, it's a chaos. It's a kind of a chaos in which they're able to compete with each other to, what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment. They're basically privatizing an entire country, and they're doing it very, very quickly. It's going to be worse than what happened to Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union, when all the oligarchs emerged from this from this privatization of assets. The same thing's going on now, but because the media is completely taken over by these corporations as well, very few people know what's actually going on. So I think to go back to this quote, we're in the age of state formation is changing. The state now has become an intermediary. No, intermediary is the wrong word, because that suggests there's a kind of a movement both ways. But it's become the administration, not of our government. We don't elect a government which then uses the state to implement things which are either protecting us or benefiting us. The government now has been, in effect, erased. The government has merely become the administrative body of the state. But the real government, this world government, and they're using these terms openly now. Klaus Schwab, I think was it March or April? He went to the World Government in Dubai, the World Government Conference. The talk that was coming out of the WEF annual conferences this year, everyone was talking about a global governance, or one system, which of course was to save the planet. These are the ones who are running now, and they don't seem to have any kind of controls on them at all from our governments or the state itself.
Simon, I've been successful in getting through just around about half of the ground I wanted to cover with you today, and I'm afraid we're out of time. That's been tremendous. I wonder if we can impose on you one more time, if we could arrange a follow-up to this so we could cover the second half of your book. I thought your summary there, that what we have now is a situation where real government is world government, is a beautifully compact way of explaining the nature of the problem that we're facing. And I'd like to expand on that if you can join us again in maybe a week or two, whenever's convenient for you, so that we can pick this conversation up. Would that be okay?
I think that would be lovely. Thank you very much. I really enjoy that, because the second part of the book moves on to other things like morality and how we can fight back about this. And this is important. It's important. I try to paint a picture of what is lying for us in the future, but that doesn't mean that I think it's going to happen. And we should never forget that human beings still run the world. We just have to find out how to reclaim both our humanity and our grasp on the world as well. So yeah, I'd love to come back and talk to you about the second half.
Lovely. Until then, Simon, thank you very much.